When we imagine the Jurassic period, we often picture a world finally settled into dinosaur dominance, where enormous bodies and ecological control seemed inevitable rather than uncertain. In reality, the Jurassic began not as an age of triumph, but as a fragile recovery following repeated environmental collapses that had already erased much of the world dinosaurs inherited. The planet they stepped onto was unstable, reshaped by fire, chemistry, and failure, and it offered no guarantee that dinosaurs would survive long enough to dominate it. What followed was not a smooth rise to power, but a series of lesser-known extinction pulses that nearly ended dinosaur evolution before it fully unfolded. These crises did not arrive as a single dramatic catastrophe, but as repeated shocks separated by incomplete recoveries. Each pulse weakened ecosystems in different ways, removing species quietly rather than through obvious mass die-offs recorded clearly in stone. Survival during this time depended not on size or dominance, but on flexibility and tolerance for unstable conditions. The first major pressure emerged from deep within the Earth itself. During the early Jurassic, enormous volcanic provinces began releasing extraordinary volumes of lava and gas over spans lasting hundreds of thousands of years. These eruptions did not end quickly, but continued long enough to overwhelm natural systems that normally stabilized climate and chemistry. Carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, and aerosols entered the atmosphere faster than forests, oceans, and soils could absorb them. Global temperatures rose unevenly, producing heat stress followed by instability rather than a new stable climate. Land ecosystems struggled to adjust, but the most severe consequences unfolded in the oceans. As atmospheric chemistry shifted, ocean chemistry followed, reducing oxygen levels in waters already near biological limits. Warmer oceans held less oxygen, shrinking habitable zones for marine life across entire regions. Circulation patterns weakened, disrupting nutrient flow and collapsing food webs from the bottom upward. Reef systems declined, marine predators vanished, and complex ecosystems unraveled without dramatic signals of sudden extinction. This collapse announced itself not with destruction, but with absence. The oceans, which buffered climate and supported terrestrial systems, began failing quietly. What happened at sea did not remain isolated from life on land. Reduced oxygen and disrupted carbon cycles fed back into the atmosphere, destabilizing weather patterns worldwide. Seasonal predictability weakened, producing droughts, floods, and temperature swings that stressed terrestrial ecosystems already under pressure. Dinosaurs expanding into new niches encountered environments that could not sustain specialization for long. Many early dinosaur lineages disappeared during these intervals without leaving clear extinction boundaries in the fossil record. Their loss was too gradual to appear catastrophic, yet too rapid for populations to adapt. Body size, narrow diets, and ecological specialization became liabilities rather than advantages. The Jurassic world narrowed its tolerance for error. Survival increasingly favored species that could endure heat, scarcity, and fluctuating resources rather than dominate stable environments. Even the dinosaurs that survived these pulses did not immediately thrive. They persisted through stress rather than expanding freely. Recovery followed collapse, but it was uneven, incomplete, and repeatedly interrupted. New ecosystems formed on weakened foundations rather than restored ones. Dinosaurs expanded into emptied ecological space, not because conditions improved, but because competitors had vanished. Each recovery carried the imprint of earlier collapse within it. At several points, dinosaur diversities fell dangerously low. Another sustained shock could have ended their story before it fully began. Volcanism continued, oceans remained unstable, and recovery always lagged behind disruption. The planet resisted stability longer than life expected it to. Dinosaurs survived not because the Jurassic was kind, but because they adapted faster than the Earth could erase them. The Age of Giants began only after surviving a world that came close to ending it early. The volcanic forces that destabilized the early Jurassic were not brief disasters, but prolonged processes that unfolded slowly enough to reshape the planet without ever announcing a single moment of collapse. These eruptions were tied to the breakup of Pangaea, when stretching crust thinned and cracked, allowing magma to rise repeatedly through long fissures rather than isolated volcanoes. Lava flows spread across vast regions, covering landscapes again and again, while gases escaped continuously into the atmosphere over hundreds of thousands of years. This kind of volcanism was not spectacular in the short term, but devastating over geological time. Carbon dioxide accumulated steadily, overwhelming natural carbon sinks, and pushing global temperatures upward in uneven, unstable steps. Sulfur compounds injected into the atmosphere created short-term cooling pulses that alternated with longer warming phases, preventing climate systems from settling. Life was forced to adapt not to a single extreme, but to constant oscillation between stress states. Forests expanded and contracted repeatedly, never fully recovering before the next disruption arrived. Soils weathered rapidly under altered rainfall patterns, reducing nutrient stability for plants and the animals that depended on them. Rivers shifted course as erosion intensified, further fragmenting habitats already under pressure. Dinosaurs living through this period faced an environment that punished specialization and rewarded tolerance above all else. Large, slow-reproducing species struggled to maintain populations when conditions changed faster than generations could adapt. Smaller, more flexible lineages persisted not because they were dominant, but because they could survive long enough to reproduce under stress. Yet the greatest damage was still unfolding far from land, beneath the surface of the oceans. As atmospheric carbon increased, more dissolved into seawater, altering chemistry and reducing oxygen availability. Warmer oceans held less oxygen overall, shrinking habitable zones and compressing marine life into narrower layers. Circulation patterns weakened as temperature gradients flattened, reducing the mixing that normally replenished deep waters. Entire regions of the ocean became stagnant, supporting little complex life despite appearing outwardly calm. These conditions produced widespread marine anoxia that did not kill instantly, but eroded ecosystems slowly from within. Plankton communities shifted, destabilizing the base of marine food webs that had taken millions of years to assemble. Invertebrate diversity declined, reef systems collapsed, and large marine predators vanished from many regions. The fossil record records these losses as gaps rather than layers of destruction. The oceans did not explode into extinction. They thinned until complexity could no longer sustain itself. This marine collapse fed back into terrestrial systems through disrupted carbon cycling and altered climate regulation. With the oceans no longer buffering atmospheric change effectively, weather systems on land became increasingly erratic. Droughts intensified in some regions while flooding increased in others, fragmenting ecosystems further. Dinosaurs expanding into newly available niches encountered landscapes that could not support long-term stability. Many lineages disappeared during these intervals without ever becoming abundant enough to leave a strong fossil signal. Their extinction was quiet, incremental, and nearly invisible without close examination of the rocks. What survived did so not because conditions improved, but because those species could endure prolonged uncertainty. Recovery followed collapse, but it did not restore previous ecosystems. New communities formed under altered chemistry, climate, and biological constraints. These recoveries were fragile, vulnerable to the next volcanic pulse or oceanic shift. The Jurassic became a period defined by repeated rebuilding rather than sustained growth. At several points, dinosaur diversity approached dangerously low thresholds. Another prolonged volcanic surge or deeper ocean collapse could have erased them entirely. That this did not happen was not inevitable, but contingent. Dinosaurs persisted because some lineages remained adaptable enough to survive repeated planetary stress. Their future dominance depended not on one recovery, but on surviving many near failures. Before dinosaurs ruled the world, they first had to endure a planet that repeatedly tried to erase them through fire that never truly ended. While volcanic pressure reshaped the atmosphere and land, the most decisive struggle of the early Jurassic unfolded silently beneath the surface of the oceans. Oceans are often treated as stable backdrops to life on land, but during this period they became the primary drivers of ecological collapse. As global temperatures rose, the physical structure of the oceans changed in ways that undermined their ability to sustain complex life. Warm surface waters became increasingly resistant to mixing with colder, oxygen-rich deep waters. This stratification reduced circulation, trapping nutrients and oxygen in narrow layers near the surface. Below these layers, vast regions of the ocean slowly lost the oxygen necessary to support animals. These anoxic zones did not spread explosively, but expanded gradually, creeping across continental shelves and deep basins alike. Marine organisms adapted to narrow oxygen margins found their habitats shrinking year after year. Mobility, once an advantage, became a liability, as suitable conditions fragmented into isolated pockets. Plankton communities shifted first, altering the foundation of marine food webs long before larger animals disappeared. When primary producers changed, every level above them was forced to respond or fail. Filter feeders declined as plankton availability became erratic. Reef systems weakened as symbiotic relationships broke down under chemical stress. Predatory species lost reliable prey and began disappearing from the fossil record without dramatic extinction horizons. This thinning of marine life reduced the ocean's role as a stabilizing force for the planet's climate. Carbon that would normally be absorbed and stored instead remained active in the atmosphere. Feedback loops intensified, linking ocean collapse directly to atmospheric instability. Weather patterns on land became more extreme as the oceans lost their buffering capacity. Seasonal cycles weakened, producing prolonged droughts in some regions and intensified rainfall in others. Terrestrial ecosystems experienced stress not only from heat, but from unpredictability. Dinosaurs dependent on consistent food sources faced repeated population crashes. Specialized herbivores struggled as plant communities shifted rapidly in response to climate swings. Carnivores reliant on those herbivores followed them into decline. The early Jurassic fossil record reflects this instability through uneven preservation and sudden absences rather than clear extinction layers. Entire lineages vanished between formations, leaving little trace of their disappearance. These losses accumulated slowly enough to evade immediate detection, yet rapidly enough to erode biodiversity severely. At multiple points, dinosaur ecosystems approached functional collapse rather than dramatic extinction. Survival depended on tolerance for scarcity rather than dominance within stable systems. Species that could exploit multiple food sources or endure long periods of stress persisted when others failed. Even so, recovery remained uncertain and incomplete. As volcanic activity continued, the oceans remained unstable, preventing full ecological restoration. Each brief recovery phase was followed by renewed stress, reinforcing fragility rather than resilience. Dinosaurs did not expand because conditions improved, but because repeated collapse removed competitors faster than they were replaced. The Jurassic world became a sequence of narrow, survivable windows rather than a single, long era of growth. At several points, the margin between survival and extinction grew dangerously thin. Another prolonged episode of ocean stagnation could have ended dinosaur dominance before it began. That this did not occur was the result of contingency rather than inevitability. The oceans eventually began to recover slowly, restoring circulation and oxygen to previously dead zones. This recovery created opportunities, but only for lineages capable of enduring prolonged uncertainty. Dinosaurs entered the later Jurassic not as conquerors of a stable world, but as survivors shaped by oceans that had nearly erased them. Recovery in the Jurassic did not arrive as a return to what had been lost, but as a slow reassembly of life under altered rules. As volcanic output gradually declined, atmospheric chemistry began to stabilize, unevenly rather than uniformly. Carbon levels remained high, but stopped accelerating fast enough for ecosystems to regain a narrow margin of predictability. This pause did not restore balance, but it reduced the rate of collapse just enough for survival to expand again. The oceans were the first systems to show partial recovery, though their healing was incomplete and fragile. Circulation slowly strengthened as temperature gradients widened between surface and deep waters. Oxygen returned to regions that had been stagnant for hundreds of thousands of years. These returning waters did not revive old ecosystems, but created space for new ones to form. Marine life reappeared cautiously, with simpler communities establishing themselves before complexity followed. Food webs rebuilt from the bottom upward rather than from apex predators downward. This slow marine recovery restored some of the ocean's ability to buffer atmospheric change. As that buffering returned, climate on land became marginally more stable. Seasons regained structure, though variability remained higher than before the collapse. Terrestrial ecosystems responded cautiously to this reduced volatility. Plant communities expanded unevenly, favoring species tolerant of heat and chemical stress. Forests returned in patches rather than continuous expanses. Open landscapes remained common, reshaping herbivore movement and feeding strategies. Dinosaurs adapted to this mosaic world by shifting behavior rather than relying on specialization. Generalist feeders expanded while narrow specialists remained rare. Body plans that allowed efficient movement across fragmented habitats became increasingly common. Growth rates accelerated in some lineages, allowing faster recovery after population crashes. Reproduction strategies shifted toward resilience rather than optimization. These changes did not produce immediate dominance, but they reduced vulnerability to renewed stress. Each generation carried adaptations shaped by instability rather than abundance. Ecosystems rebuilt under the assumption that collapse could return at any time. This expectation shaped evolutionary trajectories across land and sea. Dinosaurs that thrived were those capable of enduring uncertainty rather than exploiting stable niches. Competitors that depended on consistent environments struggled to re-establish themselves. The balance of power shifted gradually rather than dramatically. Dinosaurs filled emptied roles not through superiority, but through persistence. As recovery continued, diversity increased, but it did so cautiously. Ecosystems layered complexity slowly to avoid renewed collapse. The Jurassic world remained sensitive to disruption long after volcanism subsided. Stability was provisional rather than permanent. This prolonged recovery period shaped the character of later Jurassic life. Dinosaurs emerged not as products of ideal conditions, but as survivors refined by repeated stress. Their rise reflected endurance rather than inevitability. The ecosystems they dominated bore the marks of earlier failure embedded within their structure. Life moved forward carrying the memory of collapse in its biology. The Jurassic recovered, but it never forgot how close it had come to ending before it truly began. By the Middle and later Jurassic, dinosaurs finally appeared to dominate the planet in ways that seemed stable, expansive, and permanent. Vast herds crossed open landscapes, large predators occupied the top of food webs, and dinosaur diversity increased across nearly every continent. Yet this dominance rested on foundations shaped by repeated failure rather than uninterrupted success. The ecosystems dinosaurs inhabited had been simplified, rebuilt, and reshaped by earlier collapse. What survived into this period was not the best of earlier worlds, but the most tolerant. Dinosaurs flourished because they were already adapted to instability long before conditions improved. Their rise was not the beginning of a golden age, but the outcome of volcanism never fully disappeared, and background environmental stress remained a constant presence. Oceans continued to fluctuate in oxygen levels, reminding ecosystems that stability was conditional. Climate patterns remained more variable than in earlier eras, reinforcing the need for flexibility. Dinosaurs that thrived were those able to exploit changing conditions rather than depend on fixed ones. Large body size became advantageous only after food webs recovered enough to support it. Even then, growth and reproduction strategies reflected caution rather than excess. Many lineages retained traits suited to scarcity, such as efficient metabolism and broad diets. These adaptations, forged during their extinction, now supported expansion. Competitors that had not survived earlier instability never returned to challenge dinosaur dominance. The Jurassic world thus carried a hidden imbalance shaped by selective survival. Dominance emerged not from competition alone, but from the absence left by collapse. This pattern created ecosystems that appeared rich, yet remained vulnerable beneath the surface. When conditions shifted again in later periods, these vulnerabilities would resurface. The Jurassic did not eliminate extinction as a force, but postponed its next expression. Dinosaurs ruled a world that had already demonstrated how quickly dominance could unravel. Their success was contingent on conditions remaining within narrow tolerances learnt through hardship. Each expansion carried the risk of renewed collapse if those tolerances were exceeded. In this fragile balance defined the Jurassic more accurately than images of endless abundance. The age of dinosaurs was built on survival, not certainty. Earlier extinction pulses shaped evolutionary pathways long before dominance was visible. Without those pulses, dinosaurs might have remained marginal rather than ascendant. Without survival through instability, dominance would never have materialized. The world that almost ended early left its mark on every later success. Jurassic ecosystems thrived, but they did so on borrowed stability. The memory of collapse was embedded in biology, behavior, and ecological structure. Dinosaurs ruled, not because the planet favored them, but because they endured when others failed. Their story is one of persistence rather than inevitability. The Jurassic stands as a reminder that dominance often follows survival, not the other way around. The world did not grant dinosaurs their age freely. It tested them repeatedly before allowing expansion. What followed was not guaranteed success, but conditional stability. The Age of Giants emerged from a planet that nearly erased them before they ever ruled, and in that near ending lies the true beginning of dinosaur dominance. History rarely ends in certainty. What survives does so through endurance, adaptation, and the quiet ability to continue when conditions refuse to cooperate. These stories remind us that the past was not inevitable, but shaped by moments where survival mattered more than dominance. If you appreciate calm, long-form history told without urgency or spectacle, subscribe to Terra Stories, where we take time to understand how the world became what it is.